Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to try to say a few things that I know a little bit about. And so what I'm going to try to do is offer you some history and some mystery and some hope. A little bit, anyway. So starting with the history. I didn't bring any visuals, but hey, they're all over the walls. So you can just look at the pictures because I'm going to harken back to the capture era, 1965 to 1976, in that era, when nobody knew anything about these whales. This is really a scientific tale of discovery because it is really amazing, and it all depended on the scientific method of observation, documentation, sharing with peers, arriving at consensus. Because before the captures, during the captures, actually, nobody knew anything about these whales. In fact, you could say they knew less than nothing because all they had were superstitions and myths about the vicious predator that would rip you to shreds if they got a chance. So nobody really knew how many there were or anything about them, their birth rates, or what the populations were, and yet they were capturing them. They were just taking them out wholesale. The roundups at Penn Cove, where Toki was taken in 1970, was a prime example of that, and that precipitated a lot of things. For one thing, by virtue of a schoolgirl's letter to Senator Magnuson, it helped to actually draft the Marine Mammal Protection Act that finally passed in 1972. But basically, nobody knew anything about them. They didn't know that there were different types of whales. Nobody conceived of that because there is no analog in wildlife science. There isn't any other species that behaves and that forms themselves into populations like orcas do. None. There aren't like bears on a mountain where some of them will eat only berries and some will eat only rodents and they never meet or mix. That doesn't happen, but that's what we have here. They look alike, but they're separated genetically by hundreds of thousands of years. So this science really began because of the captures, first in Canada in about 1972, 73. Dr. Mike Bigg was employed to go out and count the whales. How many are there? So he got a pretty good count. And then NOAA issued a contract that my brother Ken Balcom, accepted and did the survey of the southern residents in particular. And so that's how they began to get a count, but they still didn't know that there were these other types around because that was just so hard to fathom that that could possibly be true. And of course, they didn't know anything about what they ate. So in the early years, it was all couched in probabilities, and there seemed to be two different types, and some seemed to eat fish. Some seemed to eat mammals, but they thought they were all alike. So it really wasn't until into the 80s, 82, 83, that there began to be glimmers that, maybe they're actually completely separate types. But they still didn't really understand what they ate. It really wasn't until about 1999 that it became clear that the resident types, as they were called by then, ate only fish, and not just only fish, but only salmon, and not just only salmon, but subsequent studies showed about 80% Chinook salmon. NOAA did sat tag experiments, which were horrific to the whales. In fact, in 2016, L-pod male L95 died because of an infection that was opened up from a satellite tag that was ripped out of the side of his dorsal fin. So that program ended, but it did show, and it did confirm actually, other data that showed that mainly K and L pods are along the coast. And for the last 10 years or so, they've been almost exclusively along the coast, within about 10 or 15 miles, which is the corridor of the Chinook salmon migrations. So that's where they are. And in fact, the greatest concentration of the sightings and all the data show that they are around the mouth of the Columbia River most of the time. And that is where those salmon are headed up to migrate into the huge Columbia Basin, including the remnants of the Chinook salmon headed up the Snake River. So everything confirmed that without the salmon, they are suffering from malnutrition, they're suffering from reproductive failure, they're in many ways unable to reproduce and unable to replicate their population, so they are on the path to extinction. And that became very clear by 1995 or 1999. 1995, they were looking pretty good. The trend lines were up, and then it went way down precipitously, 20% drop in 5 years. And that's what triggered the eventual listing under the ESA in 2005. So about that time, actually it was in 2016 when J28 died and her infant offspring. And that was totally unexplained because she was in the prime of her life, reproductive peak, basically. She could have done, had many more calves, and yet she just died, as other females have. And that is traced back to the malnutrition, to the lack of enough salmon to develop a full offspring and to nurture that, to be able to nurse that baby for a year after birth. And at that time, I became aware of the effects of the Snake River dams. Those are the 4 dams on the Snake River. The Snake is equivalent to the Columbia in terms of its watershed and its salmon production capabilities, in terms of the volume of the abilities for salmon to spawn and for smolts to get down to the ocean. But those dams block the path of primarily the smolts going downstream. Certainly the adults headed up to try to spawn have to go through a lot of obstacles, up fish ladders, but the real losses come in the smolts trying to get downstream because they don't actually swim to the ocean. They flow to the ocean. In fact, they flow often backwards, so they're actually oriented back up, hoping that they will grow to adults and go right back up that same path. But then they hit the reservoirs, and that's 140 miles of stagnant pools of still water. So they don't flow at all. So they don't make it to the ocean in time. It throws their entire metabolic timing off. They have a DNA, genetic timing that allows that transition from freshwater to saltwater. It throws it all off completely. And in those reservoirs, they become subject to all sorts of predators and diseases. Is there any chance to quiet that down a little bit? So they just don't make it. Between 8 and 10 million smolts are estimated to be lost before they make it to the ocean. So there's been a lot of campaigning, a lot of talk. There have been 5 federal court cases. There have been at least 3 in partial environmental impact statements written to try to address that problem of the ESA. These are ESA listed salmon that are endangered, so it is a violation of federal law to kill them, and the dams are killing them. And 5 federal court cases have determined exactly that and have told the Army Corps of Engineers that they have to probably take down the dams. They haven't ordered them to do so, which they could do, but they haven't done that. They've just said, go back and write another EIS and explain how you're going to save the dams. So that's a little bit of history, and now I want to give you a little bit of hope about that, because I've had a revelation in the last couple of months, which is that you don't have to go through Congress. For well over 2 decades, probably since the dams were built, the story has been out that you have to go through Congress to get approval. Everybody says that. I don't know who really started that, but it's a myth. It's not true. I'm sure it was the Army Corps and the BPA and their Congress people, but now it's journalists, it's environmentalists, it's everybody on the street, it's even from the White House. They indicate that, well, when we're all ready, when we have replaced all the services that the dams provide, which are hydropower, barging, and irrigation, that you have to go to Congress and get their approval. And so that's been this huge obstacle that is in everybody's minds that would have to be somehow gone through. You know how long it would take to get through Congress? It would never happen. So that is an obstacle that is imaginary. It's a complete myth. It's a fantasy. And yet everybody believes it. So the hope is that if people could understand, and I would refer you, and I'll be happy to send a link to all of you, to a law review article that came out last year that establishes all of the relevant laws and policies. And it turns out the Army Corps owns the dams. They built them, they own them, they can declare them non-operational, they can declare them not fulfilling the purposes for which they were built. And in fact, they cost roughly, I don't think there's any firm numbers that are made public, but roughly $1 billion a year in operational maintenance to operate the locks for the barges and for the turbines and the dams themselves. And most of it is for mitigation, for the all sorts of mitigation, everything from restoration upstream, although there's 5,500 miles of pristine watershed tributaries, streams and rivers that are perfect for salmon spawning. So there's not a lot of environmental mitigation that is needed, but it's spent anyway in a futile attempt to try to restore the salmon, but keep the dams. That's not possible. It's a binary choice. If you want salmon, that means if you want orcas, the southern resident orcas, the dams have got to go. And the hope is that if somehow that truth could be known, that it could be done by an executive order. The commander-in-chief of the Army in the White House could simply issue an order and direct the Army to remove the dams. Of course, there has to be a lot of providing of services and replacement, railways for the barges. Irrigation can be taken care of by different wells and different intake pipes in different places. It all can be taken care of. Hydropower is being taken care of, and it's not reliable anyway. hydropower has this myth of being, permanent, reliable power. Snake River power depends on water flow. Those dams do not store water. They're at a certain level. They have to stay at that level for the barges to go anywhere and for the hydropower to work at all. So they don't store water that can be used in the summertime. So their power is available primarily in the spring when it's not needed, and not available in the summer when it is seriously needed. So it's not that valuable, as that's another myth, that the hydropower can't be replaced. Anyway, all of that could be done and the dams could come down. It's actually entirely feasible, practical, and absolutely necessary to avoid the extinction of those listed salmon, steelhead, and ocean lamprey also, that are going extinct because of the dams. And of course, to have enough for the southern residents so they can bring their babies to full term and nurse them and replenish the population. So for the southern residents, the dams have to come down, and they can come down. Okay, so that's my history, and that's my little bit of hope. If that true story could actually get out there, it's based on fact. And I'm happy to give you all the legal background to establish that fact, that it's a matter of the Army Corps either deciding or being ordered to remove the dams. So now I want to give you a little bit of mystery. This is going to be a kind of a leap about how Toki, that's the whale that was in Miami for 53 years until she died last August 18th in that tank on the very verge of her return home, how she taught me about her family, about southern residents. Because she was a southern resident orca. She was captured from, we believe, El Pod, and she came from that tradition, and that is a cultural tradition. And, in the beginning of the campaign, when we started this in 1995, it was a no-brainer. It's a good cause. She's stuck in a tank. She's one of the ones that we were studying. So, of course, we want to bring her home, but I didn't know anything about her, and it only took years and a lot of interviews, different sources of information for me to get a picture of her personality, her actual character, her incredible resilience, her robustness, her strength. She really wasn't sick much at all. There's a whole other mythology going on about how she was so sick. She really wasn't. She maintained her good health. She had some kind of mental fortitude. And she did that with good cheer. She never hurt anybody. Most people have seen blackfish. A lot of the whales in captivity have harmed people. She never did that. Never hurt anybody. She might play tricks on them. She might squirt them, but she didn't hurt anybody. To the contrary, she played with you. She engaged. She built relationships. She didn't just want to be petted like a dog. She wanted to play and interact. And the people I have not weren't so fortunate as to have these kinds of moments with her. But talking to the people who have, she had a way of reaching your mind and your heart. And you knew that she knew you, that she felt you, and that she had nothing but love and affection in her heart for you. And that has happened to many people, and that is her personality and the way that she is. And I like to play amateur anthropologist and look back at the history of the southern residents, the prehistory of the southern residents, before colonial occupation. Back in the day, for the last way over 10,000 years, when there were people along the coast who got everywhere by paddling canoes. They'd be out there in their canoes to go see relatives, to go foraging, to go to ceremonies, to go to weddings and births and deaths, and everywhere they went was by canoe on the water. When you're in a canoe on the water, you're at eye level with a spy-hopping orca. You're on their level. And that's how they interacted and intermingled. Of course, they were consciously aware of each other and interacting, and with very similar families and lifespans and intelligence, mainly. The ability to empathize, to be able to reach into another's mind, basically. They got acquainted. There's just no doubt. I mean, I would love to see some record of that, some oral storytelling records, but it's a no-brainer. They were out there on the same water together. This is the culture of Southern residents, is that people can be nice, people can be good, because they revered the orcas. They considered them family members. So that is part of who Toki was, and that's who all the Southern residents are that we see out there today. That's who they are. They understand people. And now I want to give you a little bit of a mystery. I covered this at Ways of Wales, and again, I'll be happy to send you the videos to show it. But when she died, August 18, 2023, less than a year ago, her family showed up on the west side of San Juan Island. And you know, like I just mentioned, how K's and L's are almost every day of the year now. They're out along the coast. We don't see them. J-Pod tends to come in somewhere in the LWC, more often at least. They get lost up in Georgia Strait, but they're less likely to be out along the coast. But that day, actually, the day before she died, August 17, while she was struggling in Miami, she was in her death throes. She was struggling to breathe and to stay upright. And at that time, Thursday afternoon, August 17, somehow her family came in to the west side of San Juan Island, and right under the webcam, so this is recorded, good documentation for science if anybody wants to look at it, that they behaved in ways that I had never seen before. And I happened to see about a half hour of it live because it was on the webcam, and I was just looking on my phone while I was sitting waiting for an appointment. And sure enough, there were those whales, and I'd never seen them that close, certainly barely at all from that webcam. And yet they were there for that entire half hour. And talking to other people, they were there from roughly 2 o'clock to, I don't know, 5 o'clock maybe. About 3 hours, maybe more, I'm not sure. I haven't gotten all the witness accounts to be able to pin it down. But the point is, they stayed right there. And they writhed. They rolled and went one way and back another way, but they weren't doing the socializing. We're familiar with socializing when they, you know, the cuddle puddles, when they group grope, you know, whatever you want to call it. They kind of roll around on each other. There wasn't that. There was very little actual body contact. And they were multi-directional. They were sometimes spy hopping, sometimes upside down, sometimes just laying there. All of it was bizarre. And the fact that they stayed in one place for at least 2.5 or 3 hours was bizarre. And the fact that they came in from the ocean at all was bizarre. And then to find out that that was exactly synchronous with Toki in Miami dying in her last hours. Now, I don't know how that works. That's why I say this is a mystery. But I do know from brain anatomy studies that orcas and other odontocetes have what's called a paralimbic lobe, which spans the right and left hemispheres, and it's something that humans don't have, land mammals don't have. And yet, it's on the orca brain, and it is believed to enhance empathy and communication. Now, I don't know. It's a mystery. It's a mystery to me, so I'm not going to say positively, but somehow I think we should entertain the possibility as a hypothesis that they knew. Somehow I feel like they knew. I can't prove it. And that was Toki's final lesson to me about herself and her family and their bonds that I believe never ceased. So that's the mystery and the history and a little bit of hope. So I am happy to entertain questions, comments, references, anything you'd like to add, but I guess you're all just dumbstruck.
I
Yes?
wanted to
Susan?
say that Rosie Caillou, James, and our Osalish advisors and friends had told us that, well, many of the things she explained before she knew about any of this that happened with the whales, that she knew as Toki was struggling and taking, that her last day, that her spirit was with her family.
Mm-hmm.
And then she had described how, after Toki died, she described how Osalish peoples and orcas, how they behave when they lose one of their own, and it was how Elpot had acted very next day. That was really interesting,
Right.
because it matched perfectly with how the whales had acted.
Yeah. It went on the next day, too.
Yeah, and the timing of Toki's last hours was when the whales were acting like that. None of us knew that Toki was dying at that point.
Yeah.
But Rosie she has that extra special communication with ancestors.
Right. Well, that certainly helps explain it.
But she said that Toki's spirit was with her family when she was dying. And that, anyway, it helped knowing that, as horrible as it was. But it was really interesting that we had that webcam footage that showed behavior we never saw.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are barely getting to know them. And that ties in with avoiding their extinction. Southern residents are on the path to extinction. And they are unique and they are amazing, and we hardly know them at all. So on that note, thank you very much.